Hello, I'm John Davis. I'm head of the technical department at ACCA. In this short film, we're going to be speaking about the issue of bribery and what the increasing level of regulation of bribery means for businesses. And to join me in this discussion, I'm pleased to welcome John Burbidge-King, who is CEO of Interchange, a company that advises businesses on how to mitigate bribery and other forms of ethical risk. The starting point for our discussion is going to be the UK's Bribery Act of 2010. Now, this was a piece of legislation that many people had been calling for some time, since the UK's long-standing anti-corruption legislation and the way it was being enforced was thought by many to be not keeping pace with the UK's obligations under international treaties. The new Act has modernised and redefined the statutory offences of giving, offering and taking bribes, but the element of the new law which has attracted most attention, particularly from businesses, has been the new corporate offence of bribery. This is potentially a far-reaching provision since it applies to all UK businesses as well as to any business that conducts any business in the UK. And what it means is that any business that is covered by the new Act can commit the new corporate offence of bribery if any of its employees, agents or intermediaries offer, give or receive bribes and the business concerned fails to put in place what the law describes as adequate procedures to prevent those individual acts of bribery from occurring. John, first of all, your company advises businesses all around the world. What would you say is the current level of awareness of bribery risk?
I engage with companies big and small, and they understand what is meant by a bribe. However, there is some confusion about the applicable legislation and legal terminology, as highlighted in the ACCA's recent excellent report on combating bribery in the SME sector. Bribery and corruption can be expressed in different ways worldwide, in legislation and in dialogue. Therefore, when engaging with our customers, we define corruption as the abuse of power for personal gain. Now, that power could be exercised by anyone in authority, be they a government minister or a procurement manager. So, corrupt acts in the pursuit of that personal gain may include committing crimes of demanding or accepting bribes, fraud, theft by deception, theft, stealing the property of another, and money laundering to move the ill-gotten gains. Now, these are often transacted by electronic transaction, which of course generally leaves a trail. Now, this all tells us that companies need to address corruption risk in the round and not segregate and separately manage each of these vulnerabilities. Most people understand what a bribe is. Petty bribes are those demanded or offered to an official to secure services for which a person is ordinarily entitled to. Examples would include paying a customs official to move goods out of the docks or to have an electricity or telephone line installed. These small grease payments are known as facilitation payments. They are illegal under the UK Bribery Act, regardless of what some would view as custom and practice. Now, companies are well aware of grand corruption, large bribes to secure or retain business. In countries where corruption is more prevalent, many companies will sadly default to a position it is impossible to do business without paying a bribe, or it's the business culture. And in Indonesia, I've heard it said, it's all about making everyone happy. The prevalence of bribery, a bribery culture in a country is indefensible under the UK Bribery Act. And history is littered with examples of grand corruption where the clear objective is for those in power to gain from their position. Examples might include the former President Marcos of the Philippines, to the recent media and other allegations over the Sochi Winter Olympics. So back to awareness. Yes, most know what bribery and corruption looks like, but the acid test is, do they have the will, in effect the moral compass and well-embedded corporate values to mitigate bribery risk?
Looking more specifically at the new corporate offence of bribery in the UK Bribery Act, what are the main things that a business needs to do in order to put in place the required adequate procedures under Section 7 of the new Act?
Okay. The UK Ministry of Justice guidance to the Bribery Act, which is a statutory requirement, sets out the adequate procedures organisations are advised to adopt to prevent bribery. Now, adoption of these principles is not mandatory unless the business is regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, in which case they are a requirement. Evidence of these adequate procedures is the only legal defence an organisation has against a Section 7 or corporate offence of failing to prevent bribery. These 6 principles in the guidance are, in brief, proportionate procedures, covering the management of agents, other third parties, hospitalities and gifts, entertainment, as well as mechanisms to report bribery. Top-level commitment, leadership from the board and throughout the organisation. Risk assessment, a systematic approach to assessing and documenting the nature and extent of exposure to external and internal bribery risks. Due diligence of persons who will perform services for or on behalf of the organisation. Effectively, companies must properly know about and document with whom they are doing business. Principle 5 is communication, including training, and finally, monitoring and review to make improvements where necessary.
Do you think this official guidance addresses all the questions that businesses will be asking, or are there still grey areas? And if so, what do you think are those grey areas?
Well, the good news is that this statutory and practical guidance actually exists, and it's relevant to both large and small businesses. Being principle-based, it does what it says on the can, but it is guidance, not regulation, and sets out what constitutes adequate procedures. You ask what's not so good. Well, the guidance is open to interpretation by professionals, lawyers, business, and eventually the court, as it's laced with the notions of proportionality and appropriateness. Now, for those used to a rule set or a regulatory tick list, the guidance on first appearance is more obscure, as it needs interpretation and implementation. SMEs may find this difficult without advice. Therefore, if a corporate ethics wheel falls off, it will be down to the courts, or more precisely, the jury, to decide if the company had a sufficient level of adequate procedures to prevent bribery.
So we have the Act itself, we have the official guidance issued by the Ministry of Justice. What are the other tools which are currently available to businesses to help them in trying to mitigate their exposure to the risk of bribery?
There's a wealth of good and anti-bribery guidance, and examples include the Transparency International Business Principles, from the OECD, the UN Global Compact, and from trade associations and professional bodies like yourselves. But for a resource and time-constrained smaller company, there has been a call for a simpler approach. Hence, British Standards, in conjunction with more than 60 organisations, developed and launched the BS 10500 anti-bribery management system. This is appropriate for large, small and global businesses. A standard has the advantage of clearly articulating and providing a familiar template for embedding adequate procedures as set out in the guidance to the Bribery Act. BS 10500 is not jurisdiction specific either, and it's drawn from a wide range of international experience. Hence, it's being fast-tracked into ISO 37001. It will be of value to companies regardless of nationality or domicile. Because these standards can be externally certified, they will become the international benchmark of corporate competence in mitigating bribery risk for customers and for companies alike.
As you've already mentioned, John, we at ACCA last year carried out our own survey, an international survey, into the extent to which the SME sector in particular was impacted by bribery and the risk of bribery. And one of the striking findings from this survey was that a large majority of the SMEs that responded to our questionnaire did not want to see any differentiation made between the demands made of large companies and public bodies on the one hand and SMEs on the other hand. Now that I think is quite interesting, given that in the UK over the past year or so there have been calls in many quarters for SMEs to be treated differently from larger companies. So the feedback from our survey suggests that many SMEs do not want the law to treat them differently or more leniently. Did that surprise you or encourage you at all?
Well, given my earlier comments and the findings of the ACCA report, it is often difficult for a company to identify and take the appropriate steps of adopting a robust anti-bribery measures. But SMEs, large companies, international, domestic, if they aspire to be top-notch world-ranking business, there really are other reasons why addressing bribery adds value, and I'm going to raise a few of these. Why? Well, first, it's increasingly likely that to do business with some customers, evidence of having addressed ethical issues will be a positive differentiator. And that applies to small and large companies, particularly those smaller companies in supply chains. So, properly reviewing a company's anti-bribery procedures will alert you to other potential risks, including newer risks of cyber and the increasing problems of fraud and other ethical risk. For those exporting into higher corruption risk markets, you will find creating mechanisms for improving the quality of decision-making and risk management will enable access to new opportunities, which smaller companies may not have gone for in the past. For directors of companies, and especially the financial director, who will have fiduciary duties too, he will sleep better at night knowing more about with whom his company is doing business with and what his business associates up to. As Warren Buffett said, it takes 20 years or more to build a business reputation, but just 5 minutes to destroy it. And if you really think about that, you will want to do things differently.
So I think, to summarise what you're saying, not only do businesses increasingly have regulatory obligations to comply with anti-bribery procedures, but it also is very often in their best interest to make sure that they do as much as they can to make sure that they minimise the risk they face as far as is practicable to do.
Absolutely.
John, thanks you very much.